Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Guido Palazzo. I'm going to give a little bit of a background on Guido before we dig into what we're here to talk about today. So Guido is a professional of business ethics based in Switzerland. He has advised several large multinational companies on best practices surrounding business ethics. And his most recent book is the one that we're here to discuss. It is a terrific book. If you're interested in finance or business or anything along those lines, I would highly recommend you take a read of it because it's going to get you thinking about a whole bunch of different things. But the title of the book, he's the co-author, and the title of the book is The Dark Pattern: The Hidden Dynamics of Corporate Scandals. And basically what Guido does is he walks through the framework of the dark pattern and then kind of pulls a number of case studies or examples where this has been applied, and shows how it actually plays out in real life. And some of these case studies that are featured in the book are, again, stunning. Like you'd almost wouldn't believe if you didn't know some of the facts. And some of these ones, again, are European companies actually didn't know some of the facts surrounding these or the stories surrounding these. These are stunning to read. So Guido, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So let's just start with the book itself and give us a little bit of background. We had talked a bit earlier. There's not a lot of books on this particular topic. Why did you choose to write a book on this particular topic?
Well, first of all, I would say there are indeed a lot of books on individual corporate scandals. Well, you find a book on the Uber scandal, you find a book on the Boeing crashes, on the Dieselgate, but these books are describing what happened. They never move to a kind of theoretical level where they ask themselves, is there something happening in each scandal that might apply in other scandals? So is there something like a repeating pattern across all these individual stories? And that is what motivated me and my co-author, Ulrich Hofrage, to go deeper into all these scandals, to ask ourselves, is there something repeating across the cases? Because if that would be the case, you might see it coming, right? You can read the warning signals. And on the surface, all these scandals are so different. But we found, we think, something we call the dark pattern. So it's a repeating pattern of 9 things that you find again and again in any kind of scandal. And that is what the book is about.
How did you come up with the title, The Dark Pattern? Where did you come up with that particular title?
A friend of mine proposed this to me, saying that this is a term used in software engineering circles to describe this phenomenon. Yes, so it's not that we invented the term. Dark patterns are used widely already as an idea, but I thought, well, this applies so well to what we do. We find repeating things, and they are always the same. So pattern for us was the appropriate term. And dark, of course, because it's nothing pleasant that you find in these stories. It's always heartbreaking. It's incredibly sad and illegal and immoral. So we found this a good term to describe what we do. I mean, the first idea we had was to call this book Inferno, because as you might know, there's this Middle-age classic of Dante Alighieri, the Divine Comedy, where he travels in his imagination to hell. And hell has 9 circles, and our corporate hells have 9 circles too. But our editor said, well, in America, no one knows Dante, so don't call it Inferno. But in reality, that's what it is. These are infernos. These are corporate hells where people suffer. And that is also something you don't see when you look into the news and read about Boeing crashes or Dieselgate or whatever it is. You don't see this immense human suffering in the background.
And I totally agree with you. And I think And I think that clearly comes across in your book. One of my favorite quotes in your entire book, Guido, that I've actually used for a couple other to explain to a couple other folks around here. Um, kind of some background in the book is the one that was used by one of the employees at Wells Fargo, who was a Gulf War veteran who fought in Iraq, and his comment was, look, I hate to say this, but I'm a Gulf War veteran, and I hate to compare these two things, but at the end of the day, his experience fighting in the Gulf War was actually less stressful than his time working at Wells Fargo
Yes.
during their scandal.
Yes.
Any more context you want to, like, if there was anything that really indicates, like you say, an inferno or a hell, that quote probably shows it more than anything, at least in my mind.
Yes, it does. And I think you could apply the same kind of thinking to most of the other scandals where people inside perceive their own organization as a hell, as something where they struggle to survive. And there's this scandal of Horst Telecom that we also analyze, where the corporate hell in the end led to a wave of 100 suicides in 3 years. So while at Wells Fargo, employees reacted to this incredible pressure and this toxic environment by breaking the law just to survive. In France Telecom, they reacted to a similar pressure by just killing themselves. So that's what I mean. There's so much suffering. It's people in the middle of the organization pressured into behaviors that they don't want to engage with, but they feel they have no choice, and it destroys them.
Just another the French Telecom one was the one that the case study that really stuck out the most to me. Now, part of it was I actually didn't know the story of French Telecom before I read your book, so that was new to me. But like you say, the fact that we're linking now, things to suicide is a completely different, that goes above and beyond the typical finance fraud where somebody's cooking the books. We're talking about an entire new level of of a situation here. But in all these cases, why couldn't an employee just say, hey, look, you know what? I'm going to go find a new job. Like, that would seem like in a lot of cases, the most obvious answer to say, look, if there's lots of jobs out there, and maybe you don't make the same amount of money that you would make at your current job. Maybe you'd have to take a discount. But why do you think that wouldn't happen more is for the employees to say, you know what, I'm just going to quit and move on with life?
There's a bunch of reasons for that. If you take the Wells Fargo case, I mean, just to summarize what happened there. So the salespeople were under so much pressure to achieve their sales quota, which they couldn't because they were totally unrealistic, and they were pushed towards it. And they observed their colleagues falsifying the signature of customers and opening false accounts for them without telling the customer. And you see that they get away with it. They get promoted. They get the bonus. It's tolerated, it's even desired, and then you get humiliated, yelled at, and crushed every day. So you think, why shouldn't I do the same, right? So
I see.
You feel that this is how things are done, and you think that if everyone does it, who am I to challenge my peers, right? So there's this peer pressure. You feel that, well, I'm the only one who thinks it's wrong, and because everyone does it, maybe I am wrong if everyone does it. And then you also assume, and there are quotes from Wells Fargo employees, you assume that in other banks it's the same.
Yeah.
So where can you go? If you want to work in banking, where can you go? It's always the same. And it seems to be desired and tolerated and promoted by the company. So you engage in it. That's one reason. The normalization of the deviant behavior by your surroundings, by your peers. And the other argument is that if the more you put people under stress, where they get yelled at, humiliated, threatened in front of their colleagues, the more you do this, the more energy they need to survive the day. And this is well known from victims of domestic violence, where you can also ask that question, why don't they just run away? Well, because all the energy goes into surviving the day, and you don't have energy left to think about other options. For us, it's easy to say from outside. We can say, well, just go and leave, find another job. But when you're inside, when you're exposed to the pressure, you don't see these options anymore. You don't have the energy. You just are on autopilot most of the time.
Now, you've spent a better part of your professional career dealing with ethics in the business world, and I'm just wondering, when you went through these case studies, was there anything that surprised you the most? Like, were you surprised that there was these trends across, let's say a French telecom, a Wells Fargo, and an Uber, call it three businesses that are in different industries, to some degree, different jurisdictions. They have these cultural differences, but at the end of the day, when it comes to the dark pattern, they exhibit these same similarities. I'm just wondering, before you got into these case studies, and then once you finished, was there anything that really surprised you? Because again, you spent your life dealing with business ethics. You've consulted companies, several companies, on how to deal with things properly. But I'm just wondering if there's anything that surprised you when you went through and kind of completed this project.
Well, there are several things that are surprising. And the first thing that is surprising to me is that it always happens again and again and again. It jumps
Yeah.
from company to company, from industry to industry. And people look at this from outside. They're reading the news and they think, well, this is horrible, but this would never happen here because we are different. And then it happens there. And they repeat exactly the same mistakes. They do apply exactly the same kind of wrong leadership methods as in the other cases. So what surprises me in the first place is this tremendously flat learning curve. Companies, leaders do not learn from these cases. They just repeat them. And when I work with a company, one of the first things I normally tell the leadership team when I start a workshop is to tell them, well, I'm only here because you just paid $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion in fine. Because before you paid that $1 billion in fine, you didn't think that ethics is something worth your attention. Right? You don't care about ethics unless you feel that it's gone, and then it's too late. So that is surprising, that managers do not learn that ethics is something they have to manage actively. That's a key leadership feature. The other thing that I found sadly surprising, maybe not surprising, but the extent to which you see this is this lack of solidarity. I mean, you think about these cases like France Telecom, where you have an employee who collapses under the pressure and is close to suicide, is in tears in the office, and his or her colleagues just take their laptops and go somewhere else, and they don't speak with the person anymore. And this is also known from research on bullyism in schools, right? If a bully is humiliating and torturing a child, the other children rather take the side of the bully. Why? They don't want to be the next victim. Right? So that you don't take the side of the victim. It's too risky. The same at France Telecom. There was no solidarity. People just do not want to be connected to the loser. Similar things at Wells Fargo, right? So this lack of solidarity, this bystander effect, right? You think maybe it's wrong how your colleague is treated, but you stay silent. That is what surprised me most. And this is, I think, something companies have to work on. You have to create a culture of solidarity.
What's interesting too is you talk in your book about how, you've tried to help companies, and in some cases they only bring you in order to go through the motions and to try and illustrate that they tried to go through the right process. Whereas in reality, it's the quote unquote, I'm not sure if this saying is as popular in Europe as it is in North America, but it's putting lipstick on the pig. It's, again, you're just trying to dress up the situation to make it look like something that it's not. And maybe just talk a little bit about that, because, again, you talk in your book about the difficulty of firing a top performer, somebody who is the highest salesperson, and bringing in, huge amounts of dollars into the company to try and terminate them, due to some sort of an ethical violation is probably easier said than done. And requires a certain degree of leadership in order to do that.
I mean, when a company had a scandal and they're in the news, they are in a moral shock. And that is the ideal moment to start reflecting upon yourself, do some soul searching. How did we end up in this mess? What did we do? How did our culture, our leadership style, our incentive systems and whatever contribute to this? But this is not a normal reaction. Normal reaction is, there were these 5 crooks, we fired them, and now we are a good company again. And we don't want to talk about what happened in the past anymore. It's over. So let's look forward, not backward. Big mistake. And I've seen companies doing that, but I also have seen companies waking up and changing who they were. So bringing in new leaders, having a different leadership style, normalizing ethical conversations, all these things. So I've seen both. What employees observe before or after a scandal, it doesn't matter. What they observe is, how do our leaders make decisions? Who gets promoted? What kind of wrongdoing is tolerated? Because that is what they consider the rules. The rules are not the ones written down in the code of conduct or in the leadership talks. It's what they observe happening around them in their daily practices. And if you have let's say, a toxic leader in the organization, or a salesperson who is known for doing shady businesses, but they're both successful and their leaders let them do it. The message is, as long as you are successful here, you can do these things. You can ignore compliance rules, you can abuse people, you can do what you want, because as long as you're successful, that's fine. Why do these people stay in these organizations? Why do they not get fired? Well, very often we have this idea that this is how leadership works. You have to be rough, right? You have to be risky, a risk taker, interpret the rules, make the deals. And so we celebrate this kind of behavior. That's one reason. The other reason is, well, if I have a high-performing salesperson in my team and I fire that person, it's a risk for my own bonus, right? Because who knows whether the person I hire afterwards will be as successful.
100%.
And I just think short-term, because the fact that this person makes everything toxic or leads to long-term problems, I don't care, because then I will be gone myself into my next job or my next position in this company. So we think short-term, we tolerate, we fear the consequences of making the right decisions. And what we create is a gray zone in which it's totally unclear what the rules are, where people start to interpret what is right and what is wrong. And they interpret this towards the grayer zone in these shades of gray.
It's the old saying, Guido. I remember, I was talking to one person about this and said, look, if you design a bonus plan with certain incentives and are asking people to do it, sometimes the worst thing that can happen is they actually do it. Yes. Because again, in a lot of cases, you might not actually foresee, how someone might go about achieving those objectives. You know what I mean? And it all just can't be completely financial driven. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, you obviously, you can't go through all the case studies that are out there, but I'm interested to know, like, how difficult was it to actually establish a cutoff for the case studies that actually made the book? Because I could imagine this was probably actually quite a difficult process to actually select the final X number that would actually make the book itself.
Yeah. Well, actually, we had 10 chapters on scandals that we wanted to put in the book, but the editor said, well, that's too much. Readers don't want to read so many cases. It's too confusing. Just take 6. So we negotiated them up to 7, so that we have a few cases we did not put into the book, like Purdue Pharma, for instance. We also have, we wrote new cases as we went forward with the book, on WeWork, on the UK post office scandal. So there's an endless, so FTX, so there's an endless supply of new scandals emerging on the way. What was important for us when we made the selection was we wanted to have cases from various countries and cultures. And you see there's a French case, a German case, the American case, a Chinese case, because we wanted to show that this is not depending on culture. So that people say, oh yeah, that happens in the USA, it doesn't happen here. Wrong. Or it happens in Europe and the US, but never in Asia. Wrong. It happens everywhere, potentially. And that was what led us. And we, of course, we took the cases where we had the best access to data, where we could talk with people and write the clearest cases. So, but I could easily fill a second book with another 7 cases and would have the same result.
And do all of these cases, again, the one consistency is that they all display elements of the dark pattern? That's clearly something that's prevalent in all of these cases, irrespective of geography or industry or anything along those lines?
Yes, and you can also add, it's not just companies. We have a hospital. So we had a hospital case chapter, but then I just used elements of that in the book, the Karolinska story. We have the Tour de France, which is a sport
Yep.
association. So it's not just company. We could have used NGOs, non-governmental organizations, UN organizations. The only reason why there is no UN or NGO case in the book is that there was not sufficient data.
I see.
Because on companies, you have thousands of pages of law, suits and documents reporting that. You have investigative journalists writing books on it. On non-governmental organizations, you don't find the same kind of data. And if you make strong claims, you better have good data, otherwise they sue you. So, but it would apply to any kind of other organization.
The other piece of your book that I really enjoyed, and I think it really makes you think, is this concept of human morality versus shareholder returns. And you have a lot of excerpts in your book that talk about both of these, and which ones you might think are more important than the other. What is more important? Is it more important to be good to your workers, or is it more important to just focus on shareholder returns and driving that share price? And is it possible to do both? Perhaps in the short term or in the long term. And is that the best result for a company in order to do both? I think, again, we could have probably talked for hours about this. And again, you take a look at a company like Uber, do they even exist with the corporate culture that they, kind of leveraged in their early days? But I just want to ask, as you, Guido, you probably thought about this a lot more than me. How companies do you think should they balance these two factors between, treating people the right way versus expectations from the shareholders that are saying, look, we expect your profitability to go up and ultimately your share price to go up over time? What is the right balance between those two?
Well, I would say this is a misunderstanding of managers who believe that they only can increase their share value if they abuse their own people or their customers or people working in the supply chain. I don't think that this is necessary. We have this very strange idea of shareholder value maximization that came into the world via neoliberal thinkers like Milton Friedman, who said, well, the whole society is better off if everyone is an egoistic maximizer of their own utility. So companies must maximize profit, and therefore societies are developing. And people like Jack Welch, who put this into practice and became a role model. And how did Jack Welch maximize profit at GE? Well, first of all, he was brutally cutting cost, firing 25% of the workforce in 4 years. And second, he was buying back shares, billions and billions invested in buying back shares, which means if the company buys its own shares, there are fewer shares around, share value goes up. So you have radical cost reductions, you have your own shares bought, your share value goes up year after year, but there's no substance behind that. And so you're not really creating value for anybody. And we have seen this when he was gone from GE and GE struggled to survive. And the people at Boeing were doing the same, and they came from GE. So they were working with Jack Welch and applying this to Boeing, firing 25% of the workforce in the first 4 years and investing billions in buying back shares, but then not having enough money to build a new decent airplane. So this idea that there's a trade-off between the share value and all the other duties of a company, this is artificial. If you want to increase the share value in the long run, you have to manage stakeholder expectations. You have to treat your people well. You have to produce good products. You shouldn't abuse human rights in your value chain, follow the rule of law, and so on. So you balance interests in the best possible way, all the trade-offs that are unavoidable, and then you, in the long run, maximize shareholder value. I always tell my students, I know a few companies that maximize shareholder value in the short run: Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Enron, FTX, and they all disappear because the more you don't think about consequences and just maximize artificially, blow it up, the more it resembles organized crime. That's not what you want, right? That's
absolutely. And how do you balance between, driving people, motivating people to go above and beyond? Because I think that's part of a successful company is trying to have people achieve, beyond expectations, versus, treating them the right way? Because again, if you look at a lot of the scandals in your book, I think what they were trying to do is they were trying to drive people beyond, achieve incredible results, but through extreme levels of stress. Is pushing people where their stress level has just increased to the maximum, and that is and ultimately, yeah, again, the human body just there's probably only a few people that can actually take that over an extended. The average person, myself included, would not be able to deal with that over the long term. But on the flip side, driving people to achieve high expectations is, I think, an element of corporate success. How do you balance between those two, Guido? Like, what do you where do you think you find the right balance between those two?
I think this is another misunderstanding that many leaders have, that they must create these very rough, uncomfortable situations and give people goals they cannot achieve, and then they will reach for the stars and burn out on the way, but no one cares about that. And we know from research on motivation that people work hardest when they see meaning in what they do, when they work together as a team, when they build a community. But that is not what you observe in these companies, at least that have a scandal. They do two things, all of them, that I think is highly, highly dangerous. First of all, you give people not ambitious goals, you give them goals they cannot achieve. People at Wells Fargo had to achieve quotas, sales quotas per day that were totally unrealistic. And if they would not achieve them, they would be yelled at, threatened to be fired. So not achieving your goal comes with very, very bad consequences, so that people just have fear and are stressed out. They know they must achieve their goal, otherwise they will not survive in this organization. And the second thing, and that's also coming from Jack Welch, what you add is you pitch them against each other.
Yeah.
You tell them at the end of the year, we fire 20% of you. So the low performers, the losers, they're out. So you don't have to just to perform. You don't have just to perform well. You have to be better than someone else. You have to kill someone, so to speak, with your performance so that they are kicked out and not you. Like the CEO of Lehman Brothers, the only bank that went bankrupt in the financial crisis, Richard Fuld, he used to tell his traders, you have to cut the throat of your enemy. And the enemy was the colleague, right? It was not JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs. Your colleague is your enemy. So you create hunger games and you give people unachievable goals. And the result is they burn out, they kill themselves, they break the law. Yes, in the short run, you might get a lot of performance out of it, but not in the long run. It never works in the long run.
I think that's extremely well put. I think that is very well put, Guido, is that basically there's other ways to achieve maximum performance from folks other than creating unrealistic goals and this fear of, this fear of failure and pitting people against each other. That's not the right way to go. So knowing that the research is out there, why do you think you had mentioned one of the surprises you had in your book when you're doing it is that the fact that this just continues to repeat over and over again? And, even what you've described, we could probably attach some of those, unrealistic goals, things along those lines. If you read some recent books on some highly successful companies, at least over here in North America, I would bet you we would continue to read that these companies are using those exact same tools. Perhaps they haven't imploded yet, but maybe they're in your next book, Guido, at some point down the road. Why do you think companies haven't learned that what you've just described in terms of how not to treat people, really you shouldn't do this when you're running a company? Why do you think people haven't learned?
I think those who are now in leadership positions in companies, they have been socialized in a world where this was normal, where the understanding is if you're not rough with your team, then you don't get results. They have been treated like this themselves. And so now they treat their teams like it because they think this is how things are done. This is leadership. I have to be like that. And then look at how we celebrate role models out there. The Elon Musks, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Jeff Bezos. They show psychopath leadership behavior. They don't give a shit about human dignity. They don't care about others. And we celebrate them. We say, well, this is how you are innovative. You smash and destroy everything. And innovation means to build on the debris of smashed stuff, which is, of course, not true. This is not how innovation enters the world. So it's a lot of imitation, I guess, and wrong role models lack of ethical training as well, psychological training in companies. Think about how we train compliance. We train compliance by giving people abstract, tick the box exercises on topics like insider trading. And they have to go through this once per year for an hour, the code of conduct. But what we describe in the book is the psychological situation, the psychological pressure coming from leaders towards their team. So if you don't learn about social psychology, you don't understand what you're doing with your team and how you expose them to situations where they then will break the law in the end. So there's a lot of things we need to change in organizations. So it's too much Wild West right now. And still, as you said, it's increasing. It's more and more of that. Meta just announced they need more masculine energy. Same trap.
The other thing that I think would surprise people, I think you talked a little bit about psychology, and you have some discussion in the book about some of these traits like psychopathy, and psychopathy is something that we would normally associate with serial killers in terms of why they do what they do. And, the discussion in your book is to say, well, pump the brakes a little bit. If you looked at some of these business executives and you started to give them, a questionnaire to fill out that looked at their personality trait, and they were to answer those questions honestly, you might find that actually several business executives actually show traits of psychopathy, which again is normally a trait that you would ascribe to serial killers. Now, again, we're not trying to say that business executives are serial killers. That's not the point. What we're trying to say is that in some cases they can exhibit similar traits of these individuals, and really it's they don't care. If they do certain things and it has impacts on other people, they don't really have any emotion towards the impact on those individuals. Maybe just talk a little bit about that, because I think that would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah.
That when you look in the business world, is that certain of these individuals, again, if they were to answer these questions honestly, would, show traits that really aren't that desirable, no matter what industry or culture or country you're looking at.
Well, estimations are that about 1% of the population are psychopaths. But in the boardroom, it's about 20%. It's like in prisons, right? It's much higher. And the question is why? Why do so many top leaders show these kind of features, behavior? And one of the answers, I mean, you gave it indirectly yourself, but they are ruthless. They don't care about others. They are risk takers. And that is what gives you an advantage against a peer who maybe be more inclusive, talk to the team, take more time for a decision. No, they just go for it. They smash. They don't care about side effects. And that looks like success. So you move up in the hierarchy. That's one reason. The other reason is once that kind of personality has taken roots in your hierarchy, they will tend to pull other people like themselves up the ladder. Because we humans, we want to be surrounded by people like us. And that's normal. And if you're a psychopath, of course, you want to be surrounded by psychopaths. You want people like you around you. And that doesn't mean necessarily that all these people are clinical psychopaths, but they are at least behavioral psychopaths because they learned that this is how things are done. I always tell this story about the former CEO of Volkswagen, Ferdinand Piëch, who used, when they built a new car, as the engineers told me, he would come and they would stand around that car and then he would say nothing. Then he would open the door, close it, open the door again, close the door. And if he didn't like the sound of the door, he would fire the whole team of engineers on the spot. And I was once, because he was a brilliant engineer, he could, from the sound, derive information about quality that no one else could. I was once telling this story to a group of senior leaders in another automotive company, and they started to laugh. And I asked them, why do you laugh? And they said, yeah, we also had a CEO doing that. And guess where he came from? He came from Volkswagen. So he had learned it there. And that's what I mean by behavioral psychopathy. I don't know whether these guys, it's mainly guys, are psychopaths, And I don't care. And for the victims, it doesn't make a difference. Whether you are the victim of a clinical or behavioral psychopath, suffering is the same. But what we very often find is that companies promote this kind of behavior because in the short run, it seems to be so successful.
The other question that I find really interesting, Guido, is with some of these traits, are these traits that you were born with and that they'll really never change? Or are these traits that you gather over time, whether that's the product of perhaps a time as a youngster, which was maybe a challenge, or perhaps it started in your professional career, where again, you worked in an environment that had culture which supported, things that were not necessarily right. Based on all your research, Guido, would you lean towards, these are traits that you were born with? Or on the flip side, would you say, you know what, you can be born an angel, but if you get tossed in the wrong environment, you could flip sides relatively quickly based on a new corporate culture. Where do you land in that debate, Guido?
We have both. We have psychopaths that are born psychopath and difficult to change. And we have, and that is probably the minority, and the majority is people who behave like this because they think this is leadership. This is how it is done. This is what I learned. This is what I observed as being successful. So they adapt to the environment. And what we argue mainly in the book is exactly that. We argue that looking at scandals, we make one big mistake. We think that behind these scandals, there are bad people who do it because there are bad people. We attribute the scandal to the character of a few bad apples. But that doesn't work in cases where you have hundreds or sometimes thousands of people participating. Take Wells Fargo again. Wells Fargo had 100,000 salespeople committing fraud. 100,000. How do you explain this with character? I mean, it doesn't make sense. That must be a kind of HR department that only hires criminals, or criminals who think, well, I have to work at Wells Fargo because there I can unleash my criminal energy. No, you cannot explain large-scale systems of wrongdoing by analyzing people's character. What it drives is context, and what we call the dark pattern is elements of context. If you are put in this high-pressure context where you feel like this veteran from the Iraq War, that this is like war, you struggle to survive. You do what it takes to survive. It distorts your identity, your reality construction, and you end up breaking the law, harassing, committing fraud, whatever it is, despite of who you are, not because of who you are. The context can be stronger than people. And that is the message of the book. The next scandal, that can be you and your team.
So really, really what you're saying is that this is not one bad apple. This is a group of folks who, did some things that were wrong, but to twist it even more, in a lot of cases, these were probably people who wanted to do the right thing before, or at least some of them, before they even started working at the organization. And then once they started working there, it's almost like their vision of reality, or what was accepted in reality, gets corrupted. And all of a sudden, maybe what they thought was wrong before they started there, once they're in that culture and in that group, their concept of what is right and wrong almost changes to some degree.
Yes.
Maybe just talk a little bit about that, how that happens, because really, again, the point is saying, look, this is obviously there's two types of people. You can be born with these traits, in which case that's one. But, it sounds like probably more people are ones who get into an organization and then are corrupted by its values and basically change. And again, the whole discussion on context is really, really interesting in terms of how your views on right and wrong basically change when you're in there. Maybe just talk a little bit about that in terms of context, Guido.
Yes. I mean, we talked about these psychopath CEOs, and they all play a role in these scandals, like at Volkswagen, at Wells Fargo, at Boeing. There is toxic leadership top down. But what we are more interested in this book is not their behavior. It's the behavior of people in the middle of the organization, all these salespeople and engineers who just do their job and then get pushed into illegal practices. So and that's why we consider the toxic leader from the top as an element of context. It's the context for the salesperson at Wells Fargo, the engineer at Volkswagen or Boeing. And how do these people in the middle end up in this kind of behavior. And that is, again, it's this context factors. Imagine we both work for Volkswagen. We are engineers, and we are since 20 years in a culture that was created not by this current CEO, Winterkorn, who is a psychopath, but by the previous one, PH, who was a psychopath. Over 20 years, they create a culture that is so dominated by fear that a German news magazine, when they wrote an article about Volkswagen before the scandal, said this is like North Korea. It's like North Korea. It's without the labor camps. That's what they wrote. Because you are yelled at, you get randomly fired, they throw stuff at you, you're treated coldly. They even tell you you are not allowed to have a problem. The word problem was forbidden at Volkswagen. And now you imagine you are one of these engineers in that team working on this filter technology that should comply with the US law, and you cannot build this filter because your budget is too small, the time is not enough, and it becomes too costly for the small cars you sell in the USA. You cannot go to your CEO and say, we have a problem, because that would be the last thing you do. You need to find a solution. It's a culture of obedience, of solving problems in a way that no one wants to know how you do it. You just have to do it. Rule breaking was always tolerated at Volkswagen. They had a series of scandals before where nothing happened to the people doing the wrong thing. So you have this feeling, well, as long as I'm successful, I can do these things, and everyone else does it. The other couple just cheat as well. So you construct a kind of rationale, a justification for your wrongdoing. And then over time, you routinize it and you forget about it. You forget that once you started having an issue with that. If you are at Wells Fargo, you fake bank accounts, you sell them to your clients. They don't know about this because you use their electronic signature. You charge them a fee on their regular account. It feels not so good when you do this once. You do it again, it's almost a routine. You do it again, stop thinking. You just do it. Everyone does it. You get promoted. So your reality perception changes in a way that you routinize things that you once challenged, and then you forget that you once challenged them. The ethical dimension is removed, and we call this in the book ethical blindness. So the inability to see that what you do is wrong, but you even think what you do is appropriate. Think about Lance Armstrong. When he was winning the Tour de France 7 times, he was using a drug called EPO that gave him 10% more performance. He was cheating. But when he could no longer deny that and he lost all his titles, he went to the opera show and he said something interesting. He said, well, yes, I confess I used EPO, but I never cheated. I never cheated. How can he say that? Well, everyone was doing it. All the other cyclists were also using EPO. And if everyone is doing it, I only create a level playing field. So I do not feel that I do something wrong. And this is this powerful thing of ethical blindness. You can talk yourself into a belief system in which what you do makes sense. It's totally right. And then you believe it and you stop reflecting. And then you get arrested. You're shocked by yourself. And you ask yourself, how could I ever do these things? Well, they are not who I am. This is not my values. And still I did it. Well, you are blind.
So how do you, if you're an employee that, let's say, when, is going through this, how do you know that you're ethically blind? Because I think, part of the issue is you've convinced yourself that what you're doing, maybe it's not perfectly above board, but everybody does it, and it's the old adage of, it's only illegal if I get caught. You know what I mean? That, if everybody is doing it, is it really something that is offside? And I'm not just talking about within the company. I think in some of the examples in your book, these are industry-wide issues in terms of several other companies doing it. But how do you get the blinders off while you're still in the company?
Yeah.
And is it even possible to even do that? Because again, what we talked about at the beginning was it'd be very difficult for the employees to leave. So the employees, in most cases, are probably going to stay unless you have maybe somebody who has such a high ethical standard that says, look, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm gone. This is wrong. I think those are the exception, not the, not the rule. So at least from my, just based on my own experience, Guido, but so if you assume that most of the people are going to probably get caught in this ethical blindness, how do they wake up one day and say, you know what I'm doing is actually not right?
The one thing that people advance when they get caught in these scandals afterwards, when they are arrested or when they have to justify what they did, the one thing they say most of the time is, I thought I had no choice.
Yeah.
I thought I had no choice. And I believe that they believe this. It's not an excuse in most of these cases, because psychologically it's understandable. Why did they not have a choice? Well, because they never had a plan B. They never thought about, what could I do if I would not work in this company? What could I do if I would not have this bonus, this career, or this department of the company? Where could I go? I always tell my students that the best protection against ethical blindness is plan B. Whatever you do, be ready to do something else and go somewhere else. But you have to think it through before it happens, because otherwise, in the moment, you will not find it and you will be lost, and you will think, well, I need to survive here in this environment, and therefore I have to do it. As soon as you have a plan B, you are free. You are free to say no, and I'm not going there, and I'm not doing this, and this is my limit. So that's one thing. The other thing that protects you is reflecting upon your own values. Who am I? What is my vision of a good life? What are limits of what I would be willing to do? Because if you don't imagine the situations where you would say no before they happen, you will sleepwalk step by step, in very small steps, into it and not realize it. Imagine your limits, imagine your values, imagine who you are, have a plan B, and then you are pretty much protected. You can walk away while others cannot.
One of one of the stories in your book that clearly makes you think a little bit, and it was kind of before my time, was the Ford Pinto story. Maybe just talk a little bit about the Ford Pinto story. And do you think, Dennis, who was involved in that, who I think is still around today, like, do you think he looks back today and sees that there was anything wrong with his behavior? So maybe just take us through that story quickly, Guido, the Ford Pinto, and in hindsight, do you think this is an example of ethical blindness that maybe still applies today?
Well, the Ford Pinto is a fascinating case. It's the story of a new car that Ford built, the Pinto, that was highly successful. And over time, engineers at the company responsible for callback actions realized that there was this particular type of accident that happened quite often, unusually often. And that was when a car would crash on the Pinto from behind, the Pinto would explode because it was too weakly built to protect against the explosions in the back. So they made a calculation. And the calculation was, should we call back the Pintos and reinforce back of the car against this risk? Or should we let it happen and just pay the insurance costs for victims? And they had tables where there were costs for that person, a person losing an arm or leg or whatever. And they calculated the number of potential accidents per year, the cost that would be generated for the company compared to the callback costs. And the callback costs were much higher, so they decided not to call back the car, which became public and led to a big scandal. And we look at this and we think probably, well, how can they calculate human life over profit and prefer profit over saving people's life? But when you zoom into the story, and you mentioned Dennis Joya, who was one of the leaders in the callback team board at the time, you see that the story is not that simple. First of all, callback teams have clear rules about when to do a callback. And callbacks are expensive. You don't do them too often. You try to avoid them. And you do this when you can fix something. There's the brake that is loose, you fix it. And you call back. But the Pinto didn't have one problem. The Pinto was a problem. It was badly designed. Right? It was badly designed.
It was the problem.
And you cannot go as a callback engineer to your superior and say, well, the car is shit. We cannot. We have to call it back. No, you have no particular reason for callback action. That's one thing. Then these tables from insurance companies, they were supposed to use them to make calculations. Of course, they need to understand what does a life cost. And it was not them inventing this. It was insurance companies imposing this on car producers in case of accidents. Then accidents at that time were not that like today. They were normal. There was this broadly shared assumption that if you drive a car, you run a risk. There were no safety belts yet, for instance, right? So driving a car is a risk. And imagine these old American cars of that time. They are like boats swimming on a street, highly risky. So buying a car means taking a risk. And Dennis Joyer would even drive a Pinto himself. He would have no problem selling Pintos to his family members, knowing about the problem, because, yeah, that's what cars are. Cars are a risk. So you see, you can make a lot of elements. You can find out about this, the context, where you then see, okay, yeah, the people inside this context, they had good arguments on their side to decide like that. And then there's the time pressure. You have to make so many of these callback decisions in such a short time. And you have to have good reasons. Again, you don't have them, so you go for not calling back the car. And then Dennis Joyer, who later became a management professor, and when he started to reflect on this, he said, well, how could I not see it at the time? Yeah, because you have all these context elements that make you blind. You come out of that context and you see it. And we do always the same. We look at the Uber scandal, the Boeing scandal, whatever, and we think, how can they do this? But we are outside, they're inside. And they don't see what we can see because they're caught in their own routines.
And I think that is clearly evident in your book, is in when you talk about the Ford Pinto story, when you first discuss it in your book, I know the emotion I had was, whoa, like how could anybody possibly do that? Like why would you? And then once you finish reading the discussion in your book on it, you have a completely different perspective on what was done and why it was done. It wasn't just so black and white that says, look, we've got to totally ditch the Ford Pinto and get rid of them all. It's a much more nuanced answer, and much more complex. And I'm not even in the company. I'm just reading your book, Guido, and understanding the facts. I could imagine if you're on the inside, it would become much more, quote unquote, ethically blind versus someone who's just reading your book and the highlights of the story.
Yeah.
So the building blocks of the dark pattern, how did you come up with the 9 building blocks of the dark pattern? And when you first started the project, how many building blocks did you have? And how did this change once you completed the project?
We attacked this problem from various sides. First of all, we went into the literature about unethical behavior in organizations, asking ourselves what drives that kind of behavior. What are the typical things that explain wrongdoing of managers? A second thing we did, we wrote down the stories. We had for each of the scandals about 30 pages of text. We would just tell the story without interpretation. And we just write it down, what happened. We gave these stories to people who were inside the companies or people who wrote about these stories, and we asked them, is this what happened? Is there something we miss? Do we have to add some information? When we had the feeling, we have the story, we have described what happened, we gave those cases to our students. And we asked them to read 2 or 3 or 4 of these cases and to compare and see, what do you find? What are elements across all these cases that appear again and again? And they came pretty much up with what we call the dark pattern. So it is there. You can find it by just reading the stories and comparing them. And nobody has done this. So as I said at the beginning, we know about most of these scandals by just reading one account, one book about Purdue Pharma. Then we read a book about Uber, and we never compare. But as soon as you start comparing, it's so obvious. Right? It's toxic leadership. It's unachievable goals. It's wrong incentives. It's this inner Hunger Games. You see it once you look at the cases, and that's how we came up with it.
When you talk to some of the former employees of these companies, did you find that they were very open to talking about these situations, or were they taking a different view that said, look, I don't even want to go back to that scenario. Thanks for reaching out, but I'm going to take a pass. What was your experience dealing with the former folks who used to work at these companies?
Well, we didn't have that kind of experience. There were some people we reached out to who never responded. Fair enough. But those who responded were eager to share, because if you have been in this situation, in these scandals, you have either been a perpetrator or a victim or a colluder. You had one of these roles. You feel shame. You feel unfairness. You feel frustration. And normally the companies don't create the space where you can voice that. So many people were happy that they finally had the opportunity to share the experience. And I must say, well, it's the magic of LinkedIn. So you read court documents, you find a name, you go to LinkedIn, the person is there, you reach out. And most of the time they answer. And they read your case, they give you additional information, they give you documents partially. We only had to be careful that we could triangulate whatever came from anonymous sources by other sources so that we wouldn't be sued by the companies in the end.
Now, what about the executives who were kind of the head of the snake on some of these initiatives? Do you think that they look back and say, I regret my actions, and not regret my actions because I got caught? I regret my actions because it was the wrong thing to do and I'm never going to do them again. Or do you think it's a situation of, what, I believe what I did was right. And you know what, at the next company I work for, I'm going to basically do the same thing all over again, unless I'm told not to. Because again, you read your book and you certainly develop an emotional response to some of these executives who, were kind of leading some of these initiatives. And I'm just wondering what your experience was, Guido. Do you think they've learned from it? And not just, again, I'm saying learn from getting caught, I'm saying learn from saying it's the wrong thing to do. Or do you think, again, that they'll just never change?
Well, we haven't spoken with these CEOs, but you can read what they say in public about what happened. And I have never seen one who said, well, we made wrong decisions. We shouldn't have done this or that. What they normally say is, I was a good leader. The Winterkorn, the CEO of Volkswagen, when he was interrogated by the German parliament after the Dieselgate scandal, he said, well, I am a good leader. I always took personal care of my own employees. I had an open door, which is total rubbish, but I'm sure he believed that. He believed that he had an open door, that he was a good leader listening to his people. Because they have also a distorted view of themselves. You rarely see self-reflection on that level. I mean, when you move up to being a CEO, you have a career of fighting, of surviving, of feeling threatened, of then winning and being right all the time. So you don't listen anymore. You think you are the best and greatest. I haven't seen anyone who said what I did was wrong. What you normally find is also people say, well, I was misunderstood. The people in the middle of the organization, what they did, these horrible things, I never told them. So they misunderstood something. And the fact that you, from the top down, give them the wrong goals, the wrong incentives, make the pressure, you don't see that as being responsible for them breaking the law. And this is what I always tell people. It's not the CEO going to prison, it's you. It's the people in the middle. Because they are clever enough not to leave traces. They're clever enough never to break the law themselves. They let you do it. And if you don't protect yourself, you don't say no, if you're not documenting everything you are ordered to do, you will be caught, not them. So no learning at the top.
Do you think, that they, do you think, do you think they regret in some way, yelling and screaming at employees? I don't think that's how you would treat your friends, by yelling and screaming at them. And not to say that your employees are going to treat them the same way as your friends, but there's probably some level of morality that you're going to treat, that you're some minimum bar that you're going to treat people in a certain way. But do you think they in any way regret yelling and screaming at employees and degrading employees and this and that? Because I just think, again, that there's a right way and there's a wrong way to treat people that applies across, whether it's a work environment or, a personal environment or whatever it may be. But there's kind of a minimum bar that probably should be applied when it comes to dealing with people.
These people at the top, in our cases, they are not only psychopaths, they are most of the time also narcissists. And narcissists never regret anything about your suffering because they only think about themselves. So they will think, the way I am treated now, that's so unfair. I did so much for the company. Without me, the company wouldn't be at that place. So they think that they are the victims. There's this beautiful, this telling interview with the chief operating officer of France Telecom, the one who created this scheme, this change management process in which 100 people killed themselves. And he defends himself by saying, well, I was the one who modernized France Telecom. And there are not more suicides in the company than in France. So this is not fair to put this to put me in a position where I'm held responsible for it, because that is not the result of my management decisions. And they misunderstood us if they were too rough to their teams further down the line. They misunderstood us, top managers. We never wanted them to do these things. And I guess he believes what he's saying. That's the sad thing about the word construction of psychopath narcissists.
You know, you take French Telecom, one of the examples that really stood out for me is when they were looking to, fire people or lay people off. And there was restrictions, it sounds like, under French law that, you couldn't just fire people. So what they would do is, if they would look for people who maybe had a sick parent or relative who they were living close to, and they would relocate that person to someplace far away from them. Like that type of behavior, man, oh man, like it takes a certain personality in order to do that. And like, you even think on something like that, the person that went through with that exercise would regret what they did.
Maybe they will. But put yourself into the shoes of a manager somewhere in the middle of the hierarchy. You have all these people in your team you cannot fire. You don't need them anymore. These are technicians, right? They're technicians. That means they used for decades to install landlines, to go to households, install telephones. What you need is internet people. You need mobile phone experts. You don't need technicians, and especially not thousands and thousands of them. But they don't want to go. And you have your goals to achieve. Then they sit around. You get angry. They're an obstacle. You cannot achieve your performance with your team because of these 2-3 people who refuse to leave. So you see yourself as the victim of their behavior. You start to make their life a bit more unpleasant. Your story is one example, but you could also say, well, I forced that technician to go into a call center because they could not fire them, but they could move them to other jobs. So you make them a call center agent, and you don't give them a training. They've never been on a computer before, and now they sit in a call center, and that's horrible for them. But of course, you don't do this for them to kill themselves. You do this for them to say, okay, I'm willing now to leave the company because I don't want to work like this. The fact that then someone of your team kills him or herself, you don't create a causal link to your own leadership decisions, and you are under the pressure yourself. You might be fired. You get humiliated by your own boss because it's trickling down as a culture. So whoever is playing a role in this game is a perpetrator, but also a victim at the same time.
Yeah, there's certain parts of your book that really stood out, and that was certainly one of the ones for me. And when you go back to these 9 building blocks, Guido, is there one that really stands out among all of them as being the most prevalent of the 9, or 9 kind of all relatively equal? Is there one that kind of stands out for you?
I would highlight 2. One is this toxic leadership, which is one of the building blocks, and everything else flows out of that. The fact that you pitch people against each other, you give them these goals they cannot achieve, you don't give them clear rules, and so it all flows out of toxic leadership top down. That's one thing. And the other thing is what we call rigid ideology. So this belief system that you have no other responsibility but to maximize profit as a leader. And that somehow releases you from all kind of ethical duties, because you are taught this in the business school. Your moral responsibility is to maximize profit, and the rest will follow magically, because free markets will lead to the best result for everybody if you just act like an egoist. So if you believe that, you practice the Jack Welch type of management, and you do not even feel that what you do is immoral, but because you think, as the CEO of Goldman Sachs once said, I am doing God's work. Because if you are an egoist, the market will turn this into welfare for everyone. Abracadabra. Ronald Reagan called this the magic of the market. So if you believe in that ideology, you create these systems where you pressure people to achieve more and more and more, and you don't care about them because you think someone else will care about them, not me, not my role. So these two I would highlight as the key elements: the system level problem and the psychopathy in the leadership positions.
So if you talk about toxic leadership, how do you prevent toxic leaders from getting into the organization from the outside? It's one thing to have a set of rules, obviously having proper ethics and a good corporate environment and things like that. But when you're talking about hiring folks, you might look at somebody who has a terrific resume, and most of these people can probably sell themselves pretty well. Is that when you sit in an hour-long interview with them, you're probably not necessarily going to be able to figure out that they exhibit traits that are maybe not all that appealing. Any advice to executives, board members, anybody out there, frankly, who's in a hiring role to try and vet these people and try and, identify these folks to ensure that they don't infiltrate your organization?
In the end, that's not so difficult if you hire on CEO level, for instance, because they don't become CEO, psychopath once they're CEO. They have been like that before. So there are traces. They leave traces of this behavior in other organizations or in other positions where they have led people. There's this one case that we discuss in the book of Karolinska, this Swedish hospital. It once wanted to hire a superstar scholar and surgeon because they wanted to win the Nobel Prize in medicine themselves. They are the one who gives the Nobel Prize, so they want to win it themselves. So they found someone, Paolo Macchiarini, superstar surgeon working with stem cell research, the latest methods, and they asked the hospitals where he worked for informal feedback. And what they got was, from 3 hospitals, the following. He doesn't follow rules. He doesn't accept opinions that are not his own opinion. He treats others with disrespect, including colleagues and patients. So they had the information, but they probably thought, well, this is how good leaders are. They have to be a bit rough, so we hire him. And he came, they hired him, and he killed patients with surgery methods that have never been applied to human beings before. He killed them. And when people spoke up against him, he threatened to destroy their career. So you can see it coming. You just have to ask the right questions. But if you close your eyes, then you're surprised in the end.
The other thing I just wanted to touch on, Guido, is the aftermath of these companies. Most of the companies, if not all of the companies that you outline in your book, are still around today. They might be smaller than what, maybe than what they were at in their heyday. But after, once these situations kind of play out and actions are taken, what do you find when looking at the aftermath? Do you find that the companies learn and make constructive changes in order to prevent these situations from happening again, at least at their company? Or do you see the reverse, is that they just kind of go through the motions, do enough to, make sure this issue is addressed, maybe in the court of public opinion, make sure their legal issues are resolved, and then just try and move on with life? Because again, I think it also is interesting, again, that most of the companies that you outline in your book are still around and presumably doing okay. You know what I mean? They, again, maybe not at the height of where they were, but they're still around. What's your perspective on how this plays out in the aftermath?
Well, some are not around anymore, right? You have FTX, you have Arthur Anderson, you have Enron.
That's true. Enron's gone. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No,
Some
that's
disappeared.
true. Yeah, they do. They do.
Big
I agree.
ones. And others are left with tremendous damage. I mean, Volkswagen estimations are that the damage was 30 to 40 billion US dollars. In the case of Wells Fargo and Boeing, we are talking about 70, 80, 90 billion damage, right? And Boeing is not even finished. It's going on, creating more and more damage. So you have a lot of money lost that you could use for something else. The attention inside goes to surviving this horrible past. And so your energy is not in the future. So you pay a price for these things, even if you survive. The biggest mistake that companies make, and I think most of them, if not almost all of them, make this mistake, is they have this reflex to say, we have to get over this as fast as possible. So you deny everything. Legally, probably that makes sense, because the more you admit, the higher the fine. Your legal department tells you not to admit anything, not to talk about this anymore internally or externally. Your PR and communication department says the same. So let's look forward, not backward. You hire a new CEO who is probably paid not to process the past, but to bring you back on track. So you have tons of reasons not to talk about what happened. But you have at the same time a highly traumatized organization. As I mentioned before, you have perpetrators, colluders, bystanders, victims, and they're all still there, most of them. And they all are having their trauma that they bring with them, and it's not gone. So you need to create a space where they can process their guilt or their sadness or their feeling of being treated unfairly, whatever it is. But companies don't do that. They just want to go into the future. And at the same time, paradoxically, they do what is highly recommended. They create a speak up culture. Because speaking up was what didn't work in the past. So let's create a speak up culture. But how do you want people to speak up about future problems if you silence them about what went wrong in the past? Right? So this silence, this is so devastating and so wrong. And there's no surprise that a company like Boeing moves from one quality problem to the next, because they never learned, they never processed, they never challenged themselves. No soul searching. They just continue.
How do you prevent those building blocks of a dark pattern from even growing in the organization? Based, like you mentioned, a lot of the ethics training and things like that today is checklist based, and going through the motions. Is there one or two best practices, Guido, or perhaps more than that you would outline to say, look, like, how do you really prevent those 9 building blocks from growing inside of your own organization?
The key issue that leaders have to understand is that you must manage ethics. Ethics is not something you have or you don't have. It's something you must manage as an organization. That means you have to have experts on the topic. You have to have budgets. You have to have activities, structures. You must build it up. And it has to happen top down. You need to normalize ethical conversations top down, so that people understand to talk about dilemma situations, to talk about unpleasant things, to say that here is a problem with the rule or whatever. This is normal. This is accepted. This is what my leaders do as well. That creates the atmosphere in which then people will be willing to speak up, because speaking up then is no longer a risk. Normally, people don't speak up because they consider this too risky. They shut up. They observe something. They don't say anything because, well, why would I? Why would I risk something? Someone else can say something, not me. So speaking up is essential to stop things from spiraling into ever bigger problems. And you have in all these scandals people who spoke up, in all of them. And they were pushed back, threatened, yelled at, kicked out, silenced. And if I observe my colleagues speaking up, being silenced and threatened, why would I be the next? So you develop over time a culture of silence. And then in the end, everyone knows that things were known long before they exploded inside the company, but they remained silent about it. So it became bigger and bigger and bigger. Speaking up culture is important. Clear rules are important. No gray zone about ethics and the rule of law. Do not tolerate rule breaking because someone is successful. Do not let people start to interpret what is right behavior. That must be clear for everybody. No tolerance for rule breaking, especially also not the small rule breaking, because one of the elements of the dark pattern is it's a slippery slope. It comes slowly over time, one compromise after another, and they seem so small, so acceptable, so not problematic, but they pile up and they push you ever deeper into wrongdoing. So if you have a culture that does not tolerate small rule breaking, that normalizes ethical conversations, that turns speaking up into something that is not risky, you're pretty protected against the dark pattern.
Is there, if you look at the case studies in your book, Guido, were any of the ones able to kind of turn the dark pattern into the bright pattern, the way you kind of outline in your book? Was there any good examples of that based on the case studies that you outlined in your book?
We analyzed the case of Novartis, which is a Swiss pharmaceutical company, and they had a huge corruption scandal. And their culture showed all the elements of the dark pattern that the book describes. What they did after the fall is they moved ethics and human risk management center stage, top down, from the board, the executive team on, through the company, understanding that people do the wrong thing, not because of being bad, but because of contextual factors. So they analyze systematically these contextual pressures, for instance, to figure out whether some risks build up somewhere in the company. They facilitate the speaking up. So they take all the elements of the dark pattern and they turn this into a risk management tool. And that is, I guess, what companies have to do. You need to develop an extended understanding of compliance as something that includes psychology and ethics.
And how do you measure that? Look, from a finance perspective, it's easy to measure revenue growth and income growth and, return on investment and things like that. How do you measure, kind of corporate ethics and whether you're, closer to a 10 out of 10 or closer to a 1 out of 10 on that corporate ethics scale? Is there a good metric that you've seen that really, can measure where you are on that corporate ethics scale?
It's not so easy because you have to rely on surveys partially to understand what people say and think, and you're not sure whether they give the honest answers because it might be a risk to answer the questionnaire. But what Novartis, for instance, found out with their analysis is that in departments or teams where people would answer, my leaders engage us in moral conversations, these are exactly the same departments where there's more speak up. Because then it's normal to speak up and not risky. The paradox is that it's exactly the department where you would not need it in the first place. You would need this in the other departments, but it comes together. If you make it easy to speak up by normalizing the conversation, then you have an advantage, and that you can measure. But you can also measure some other more indirect things. For instance, it is known that female leaders leave a company faster when they experience toxic leadership than male leaders. Because male leaders would think, well, this is how the world is, I have to go through this. But female leaders might rather tend to say, well, I don't take this anymore, I go somewhere else. So if you have an above the average turnover rate of your female leaders, that's a warning signal. Burnout rates in teams, that's a warning signal. So you can find some of these metrics, but it's cultural stuff. Right? It's not so easy to measure.
And what if I probably know the answer to this question, but if an executive comes to you and says, Guido, look, I love all the things that you're saying, but at the end of the day, performance and profitability and things like that are still number one on my priority list. We're a public company. We've got, people monitoring our quarterly results. I've got a board that I'm accountable to. I've got other priorities. What do you say in response to that?
You can be successful without destroying people at companies. You can be successful without breaking the law. And there are many, many companies. So we have to realize that the scandals that we describe in the book, they are luckily the exception. They're not the rule. So you can lead with respect and dignity and still be successful. And it's wrong to believe that you can only succeed if you act like a total psychopath.
And is there any evidence to suggest that people are learning from this today, Guido? Or do you think that, these cases of toxic leadership and all these 9 building blocks are just as prevalent today, maybe even more prevalent, you would say, than they were 20 years ago? Is there any evidence to say that we're learning from it, or are things just getting worse?
In my view, we don't learn from it. Just look at the AI industry that is emerging right now. Look at some companies like OpenAI, you find the pattern. It's emerging. It's all there. It's in the open. Take crypto, the same. So we don't learn. We always think next time it's different. And I'm looking forward to my next cases because they will emerge sooner or later.
So maybe that's a good way to finish, Guido, is your book was terrific. You had to go through quite a big process to just cut the case studies down. So clearly you have a lot more content than what you had come up with for the book. But what's the next project on the table? What's kind of next down the pipe for you?
What was not yet so visible when we wrote this book is that Silicon Valley is taking the next extreme version of all that and challenging democracy as such. You have the return of fascism in Silicon Valley with Elon Musk showing the Nazi salute, Peter Thiel saying we don't need democracy. It's a tendency that I'm currently investigating to make sense of it, and that is my next project.
And do you think that you would come up with a second edition of your book on corporate scandals? Is there enough there to produce a second book, or do you think one book is good enough and it kind of makes all the main points?
I think it would be repetitive. If I can replace all the 7 cases through 7 new cases, but the message is the same. So what I do is I collect new cases, I write them up, I share them, but we don't need a new book. The message is the same.
Well, as I mentioned, if you have an interest in business, if you have an interest in finance, if you have interest in getting in corporate governance, I would highly recommend you take a read of Guido's book. Like you're saying, Guido, you might be able to read a book on example of one company or a second company, but there's not really a comparable book out there that really tries to look at common trends across several companies, which again, I think is really important when you're trying to build a good corporate environment wherever you work. And I think it's also important too, is that if you're reading the book and perhaps you're subject to ethical blindness, maybe that book would help you, Guido's book will help you realize that maybe it's time, like you say, Guido, is have a plan B, have an exit plan in order to, in order to get out. But in any event, I would highly recommend everyone take a read of it. And Guido, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate you taking the time today to talk about your book. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.